Today, we're going to be talking about how the 100 to 400 millimeter lens became my favorite lens for landscape photography. So a few weeks ago, I was giving a talk to a photography club, and as part of that presentation, I of course had images to share from my various travels and places I'd been. And as will happen anytime you're in front of a photography club, there's always questions on what lens did you use, what settings did you use to take some of these pictures. And several of the images that caught people's eye and where people would dive in and ask me, what lens were you using? What focal length were you using? It turned out it was with my 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And that's when it occurred to me just how much the 100 to 400 millimeter focal length has grown on me as a landscape photographer. Because they kept asking about these images and what focal length, and I kept saying, well, I used my 100 to 400 for that. Well, I used my 100 to 400 for that. I think it might have taken some of them by surprise that I was using a focal length like that as opposed to something like this wide angle lens, which is most commonly associated with landscape photography when you're getting started with it. In fact, if you'd have told me 3 years ago that the 100 to 400 was going to be my favorite lens, I would have thought you were crazy. It was just 2 years ago that I started playing with these longer focal lengths in the field, and when I first had a 100 to 400, I started with the Sigma 100 to 400. I actually found myself leaving it at home a lot, either because I would say, oh, it's too heavy, or things like that. I just really didn't see in that focal length, so it made for an easy lens to just leave home and not take with me. So fast forward to now, and I've found myself gravitating more and more towards this 100 to 400 millimeter lens, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So in the early days when I returned back to landscape photography, I gravitated towards using a wide-angle lens. Part of that was just because in my head at the time, landscapes were big grand scenes and environmental scenes, and you just needed a wide-angle lens to do it. In fact, I even went out and bought a wide-angle lens at the time that was wider than the kit lens I had because I felt like I had my kit lens and I could either go more telephoto or I could go more wide. And even without a lot of research, well, I need a wider angle lens because I shoot landscapes. So that's what I did. I went out and bought a wider lens. And so I'd head out to Hocking Hills, which is my regional place I like to go photograph in. It has lots of gorges and waterfalls and things. And I'd take my wide angle lens and I would get down there and I would take these larger environmental scenes. I would encompass lots of the area around it. So you'd have the waterfall and you'd have the trees and you'd have the rocks, and I'd get these nice big wide scenes. And that's just how I practice my photography. And a lot of this was taking compositions that had been done before, and it just fit well with a wide angle lens. We have family in Arizona still, and so we would make travel back to Arizona, so it made an easy way to get some more desert Southwest photography, even when I was early in my return to landscape photography. So I'd go out to Arizona, and I would take a wide-angle lens. Many times I didn't even have a telephoto lens with me, and I would set up for these sunsets, and I would go in these places and in these parks, and I'd get set up there, and I would be photographing this grand scene. And that's just how I felt like things were supposed to be. So if you look at a lot of my work from when I returned to landscape photography, you're going to see everything in sort of the kit lens mid focal length, you know, that 70 millimeters, 24 to 70 millimeter range, and wider when I added that wide angle lens to it, because I felt like that's what you were supposed to do. However, after using the wide angle lens on more and more of these scenes, I feel like I started to become more in tune with the things around me. But the wide angle lens and focal length isn't without its challenges. Let's take a look at some of those. So what are some of these challenges of the wide-angle lens? Well, if you're using a wide-angle lens, something like this is a 14 to 30 millimeter lens, and I love this lens, but there are challenges. For example, if you're photographing a lot of scenes, you're going to get a lot of sky, and sometimes the sky just doesn't cooperate. But if you have a lot of sky in your image, you sort of need, or at least want, that sky to cooperate with you, get you some of those stunning clouds, that amazing light. But sometimes the sky doesn't cooperate. I've talked about that in some of my Lindy Point videos where I talked about enjoying the process. A lot of times you'll show up and the sky is just clear blue, and a wide angle lens with a clear blue sky. I mean, it's interesting. It's fun to shoot when you're newer to landscape photography, I think, but as you start to do it more, you start to put more pressure to have that cool sky. And if you don't get it, you feel like you're walking away without something. Maybe it's super overcast where the clouds are so heavy and thick, you're not getting anything interesting because the light can't get through. So if you're only shooting with wide angle lenses, you have to be at the right place with the right composition and also at the right time. It can really lead to a lot of frustrating experiences in landscape photography because you need the environment to cooperate with you. So even in my area where it's a lot more waterfalls and gorges and things like that, and it doesn't rely quite as much on the sky in most locations, Having a wide angle lens and sort of limiting yourself to that and seeing the world through that wide angle means you're not quite able to simplify the scene quite as much. You might have things coming in from the side. You might be including too many trees. You might be losing your viewer in what you're looking at. I think it gets a little bit harder to express yourself completely through a wide angle lens. I need the good light. I need the good water flow. I need things to be looking just right in order to get this larger scene that looks good. So it can be challenging even in those types of environments as well if you're only seeing through the wide angle focal length. And that's what brings me to the longer focal length, like the 100 to 400, maybe if you're on a Canon, a 100 to 500. I think starting to see in that focal length is sort of the natural evolution of the landscape photographer. We start out with these mid to wide angle scenes, and that's great because we're out in nature a lot for the first time, so everything is new and everything is exciting, and it's hard to see the small nuances of a scene because we're overwhelmed by the grand scene. And that's why I think a wide angle lens is so popular in the beginning, is because the whole scene looks awesome. But I think as we continue to do this, we get a little more in tune with nature. We start to see smaller details that we didn't see when we first started out. I know when I first started out, I saw a waterfall. Now I can go back to those same waterfalls and I start to see smaller details. I don't want the whole scene in there. I want to highlight something special, something certain, something that speaks to me. I might even want to zoom way in and get some water texture. And I think that's the evolution of the landscape photographer. You get more in tune with nature and you start to notice things more. You notice those small details. So to photograph those smaller scenes, you start to need that longer focal length to sort of really simplify the scene, get your composition the way you want, because you want to highlight that small scene within the grand scene. And I think that's the evolution of a landscape photographer. And that's where a lens with a longer focal length starts to come into play. Now, this transition to a longer lens isn't necessarily easy. It was about 2 years ago that I became intrigued with that longer focal length. Could it help me get the compositions I wanted to get? Now, I hang out in various online communities, and I knew longer focal lengths were popular with them. When I first joined those communities, I'm like, I didn't get it. I'm like, what? You're using a 70 to 300? You're using a 100 to 400? You're using a 100 to 500? I didn't even really quite grasp that in the early days. But as I hung out more and my landscape photography advanced a little more, I started to see the attraction of those lenses. So from there, with support of those communities, I went out and purchased some longer lenses. I started out, I had a Sigma 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And I tried to use it for a while. It was a heavy lens, took great pictures, but my head just didn't see in that focal length. Like I knew I was there and I knew there was something to that focal length, but it wasn't coming naturally to me. Like 100 millimeters felt like way too zoomed in a lot of times. So I tried a 70 to 300 millimeter lens. It was a little lighter, gave me that extra 30 millimeters on that wide side, which was a little bit more comfortable. And so I carried it around for a while and I sort of juggled between the two. And a lot of times they'd get left at home even in those early days because my head just wasn't seeing it. But over time, like I said, I feel like my compositions and my creative eye continued to mature and I started to see these things a little more and I had the tools at my disposal, either the 70 to 300 or the 100 to 400 to start making these compositions. And I started using both those lenses a little more often. They started to see more time in my pack. I even did a one lens challenge with the Sigma 100 to 400. I did a video on that. I'll link to it down below. But I think that was one of the things that really helped me. I literally only took that lens out to go photograph with to Hocking Hills, one of my favorite regions to go to. And I restricted myself to only use that 100 to 400 millimeter lens for the day. And I think that sort of was the turning point. By only having that lens, I couldn't cheat and like, oh, I want to take a picture of this waterfall. Let me swap in my 24 to 70 or my 14 to 30. I only had the 100 to 400 with me, so I had to work with it. And I think that's sort of what sort of pushed me over the edge to start to be able to see in the 100 to 400 millimeter focal length. And from that point forward, I started carrying the 100 to 400 millimeter with me more and more often. So much so that I actually got rid of my 70 to 300 because I found myself really enjoying the 100 to 400 millimeter focal length. So much so that I upgraded from the Sigma 100 to 400, which was a great lens by the way, to the Nikon 100 to 400 millimeter lens because I finally felt like it was worth investing in the glass and the Nikon. But either way, I really started to become more accustomed to the 100 to 400 millimeter lens and I started carrying this thing with me more and more often. Trips across the country, this thing went with me. Up and down crazy difficult hikes and climbs, this thing went with me. I find it less and less often that I take this out of the pack, even though it's a heavy lens. Because I've just started to be able to see in that focal length a little better, and it really helped me capture images I was quite proud of over time. And here we are today where the 100 to 400 is what I would probably call one of my favorite lenses in my bag. It's not the only lens I use, but I sure don't leave it home very often. So let's talk just a little bit about now that I think my creative eye can see in the 100-400 millimeter focal length, where it gives me an advantage when I'm out on my outing. First, I am way less dependent on the sky than I was with the 14-30 or a wide angle lens. Now when I go to a grand vista where you do have this grand scene, we'll use Lundy Point in West Virginia as an example again. That scene, when I go there, my goal is to capture something with a wide angle lens. So I still take my wide angle and I take it out, and I'm looking for this grand sunset, the typical shoot into the sun, get those cool clouds. But as I've said in the past, I've been to that spot 15 plus times, and I'm still sort of chasing the photo I want. But because I take my 100-400 with me as well, I am still able to capture scenes that are interesting even when the sky's not cooperating. There's been times when it's a clear blue sky, but I get some really awesome highlights on some trees off on one of the ridges. With the 100-400 millimeter focal length, I can zoom in on that, and it doesn't matter what the sky is doing, I just care about little areas of light. That's all I need. I don't need the whole sky to do this amazing thing. I just need, where is the light being interesting? Maybe as it crosses this ridge, or while it highlights this one particular set of rocks as the sun sets, or as the sun rises. It really is helpful for capturing layers. Layers have become something I've really enjoyed photographing, and if you're having sort of a sky that's not cooperating and the wide angle lens just isn't quite doing it, you can often find layers off in the distance where if you can zoom in a little bit, 200 millimeters, 300 millimeters, you can really put together an interesting picture of layers off in the distance and not even really show much sky, either no sky or hardly any at all. So it's really helped reduce my dependence on what's going on that night. Like I said, of the 15 plus times to Lundy Point in West Virginia, while I'm still chasing my wide angle shot, I have lots of 100-400 shots that I really enjoy and are some of my favorites. One of my favorite fall photos this year was shot from Lundy Point with the 100-400 millimeter lens, because I was able to find this set of trees that was catching the light just really cool and just punch in on it. So I was still able to get a great shot. If we bring it back to Hocking Hills, my local stomping grounds, where skies aren't quite as important and it's more about the waterfalls, the 100-400 millimeter lens has really let me isolate my compositions, simplify my compositions, show just what I want to show. Sometimes it's just close up of the waterfall. Sometimes it's the textures of the waterfall, how the water's moving over a certain spot. Water flow changes all the time, so I can go to the same waterfall multiple times, and how that water is flowing, volume of water, speed of water, all of that change, which gives me different textures and patterns in the water. And with a 100-400, I can zoom right in on that and get a picture of something interesting, an abstract, a small scene, something that speaks to me, something I think I can see better the longer I've been doing landscape photography. Finally, sometimes I'm just hiking down the trail, and you're going down the trail, and to try to use the wide angle on it would be this, what's going on here? We've got all these trees and this path going through, but then there's some scene again where the light's hitting something just right, or some texture or pattern, and I can use the 100-400 millimeter lens to just sort of create the composition I want to highlight what I want to draw attention to. So essentially, as I've become more in tune, or at least as I feel I've become more in tune with nature and see things happening around me more than just the grand scene, and very much watching what the light is doing in certain areas to my left, to my right, behind me, the 100-400 millimeter has acted as a tool to really let me highlight those scenes and walk away with some really great images, completely independent of how the sky looks, or whether it's heavily overcast or clear blue or whatever. It's really added to my flexibility, which over time leaves me with something I can almost always photograph, no matter what, which just reduces frustration in landscape photography, which all contributes to long-term enjoyment of the hobby. And that's how the 100-400 millimeter focal length has become one of my favorite focal lengths. How about you? Do you have a favorite focal length? What is it? Do you still like your wide angle lens for lots of scenes? Or do you use a longer focal length like a 100-400 or a 70-300 or a 100-500? What's your favorite focal length with where you're at in your landscape photography? Anyways, I hope this video was helpful as I talk about how I think the evolution of a landscape photographer happens as we sort of move from these grand scenes all the time to adding tools to our camera bag like the longer focal length, so you have more variety and more opportunity to take some great pictures. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. And if you want to see future landscape photography content from me, including tips, tricks, behind the scenes, and mini gear reviews, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you for watching.